It's a great pleasure for me particularly to be introducing Pat Druckenmiller because I was lucky enough to be part of the search committee that hired him. And just one personal note, and I've been at UAF for 15 years, and I don't think I've ever known a candidate who clearly wanted to come here and was so well suited to the museum as Pat was. When, after he left, I turned to somebody and said, that guy is going to want to buy a plot in the graveyard here. We've got to hire him. And this is, of course, in addition to all of his many, many strengths as a scholar. He's a skier, an outdoorsman, and his wife, Lisa, is the same, and his daughter, Maggie, and we're just very happy to have them as part of our community. Just a bit about Pat's background. He received his BA from the University of Wisconsin, his MS from Montana State at Bozeman, and his PhD at Calgary. And his topic there was marine dinosaurs. And if you know how far away Calgary is from the coast, you can imagine that we're talking about quite a long time ago, perhaps 1 million years. Pat is now curator of Earth Sciences at the museum and assistant professor in the geology and geophysics department. The curators at the museum all have joint appointments in an academic department, and that is his. And Pat's topic tonight is polar dinosaurs, living the high life in the age of dinosaurs. Please help me welcome Pat Druckenmiller. Thank you.
I think we had a technical glitch there. Okay. Now we're back on track, and I'll get rid of my screensaver there. Well, thank you. Still suffering some feedback issues. Are you okay, babe? Okay. I think we're on track here. I'll try to avoid that one again. Thanks again for coming tonight. This is really nice to see such a great turnout, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about some of these wonderful dinosaur fossils that have come, not just from Alaska, I'm going to focus on that as well, but to also talk about really what it was like living up in high latitudes during the age of the dinosaurs, or the Mesozoic. All righty. So I think it's pretty safe to say that if I were to say the word Arctic, it would conjure up certain images in your mind. It might conjure up images, if we talk about the North Polar regions, the Arctic regions, you might think of things like ice caps and ice flows. You might think of tundra. And you might think of the animals that live in those environments, things like polar bears and walruses, and of course, the caribou. Likewise, if I talked about the Antarctic, the southern polar regions of this world, you think of the same kind of chilly connotation, maybe with a different cast of characters, penguins and leopard seals, for example. But whatever the animals you think about, when I talk about when you think about polar regions, you tend to think cold and chilly, cold and frozen. But had you been here on planet Earth during the Mesozoic, the age of dinosaurs, I think you would have had a very different feel, a very different kind of image in your mind about the polar regions. And in fact, the world was considerably warmer during most, if not much, of the Mesozoic, and the life was certainly very much different. What I'd like to do tonight is kind of introduce you to that world a little bit and tell you about some of the amazing life forms that were running around this planet during the Mesozoic. And I'm going to start by kind of giving you some background about that period of Earth's history in terms of time and place. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the specific sites where we find polar dinosaurs and other types of extinct animals from that era. I'm going to focus mostly, however, on the story that we know of polar life during the Mesozoic here in Alaska. Obviously, that's kind of a little more near and dear to our heart. And as it turns out, and as I think you'll see by the end of the talk, Alaska actually rightly deserves this reputation of being one of the most important places on the globe now for understanding Arctic dinosaurs. Okay, so first let's talk a little bit about the Mesozoic. in terms of time. About the last 550 million years of our Earth's history is split into 3 large chunks of time. And we've split them into those 3 large chunks of time based primarily on the fossils that they contain. And so we call those 3 chunks of time the Paleozoic, meaning old life, the Mesozoic, meaning middle life, and the Cenozoic, meaning recent life. Yes, you can see where that was going. But what we're going to focus about tonight is the Mesozoic. It's that middle period of time that extends between about 250 million years ago to 65 million years ago. It, in turn, is also divided into 3 sort of big units, what we call periods. And some of these names are familiar to you thanks to people like Steven Spielberg, Jurassic, of course, being the middle point, but the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous together combine to form the Mesozoic. We also call the Mesozoic by another name, more popular name, and that is the Age of Dinosaurs. And it is actually a pretty appropriate name. And it's because dinosaurs first appeared at the bottom part of the Mesozoic during the Triassic period, right about here, in the upper part of the Triassic, and extended all throughout the rest of the Mesozoic era. They became globally distributed in the Jurassic, and they're found all over the world as well in the Cretaceous, the Cretaceous rocks that we find dinosaurs in. They're everywhere. So it is an appropriate thing to say that that the Mesozoic is the age of the dinosaurs. And in fact, about 65 million years ago, most of them went extinct. And I say most because, and this is a topic for another talk, we do still have, technically speaking, some dinosaurs around today, except they happen to have feathers and fly around, and we call them birds. But we can talk about that more later. The next really interesting thing about the Mesozoic I wanted to point out has to do with kind of what the world looked like then. So this is our world today. This is very recognizable. We look up and we see North America, our continent here, all the other recognizable continents of the Earth. But we got to get ourselves in the right mind frame. We got to go back into the Mesozoic, and so you need to think of what the world looked like, what the continents and what the oceans were arranged like, and you'll see it's very different. And if we do that and go back to the Triassic, the very beginning of the Mesozoic, our planet looked like this. The Mesozoic was a period of time in which the modern continental arrangement as we know it sort of took shape. Because at the beginning of the Mesozoic, the continents of the world were basically all kind of glumped together, if that's the technical term. They were glumped together into a large single landmass we call Pangaea. And Pangaea broke up into smaller landmasses, continental-sized landmasses, but broke up into these landmasses that we recognize today. And I think it's an interesting little thing just to see how that happened. So what I want to show you are a series of snapshots separated by 20, 30 million years of time. And the number of millions of years ago is right here at the top of the screen. But it's just easier to look at the red arrow at the bottom to see kind of where you are. And I've also put a red dot on this chunk of land, which is what will become North America, but it had not yet actually existed as North America at the beginning of the Mesozoic. So let's just scroll through a couple of pictures here and see how it changed as we go forward in time through the Mesozoic. By 220 million years ago, an important event started to happen. We started to see that North America was beginning to break away from these southern continents, which we call Gondwana. And this continued on as we move farther up now into the beginning of the Jurassic, and we start to see that the northern part of what will become the Atlantic Ocean has begun to separate Africa from North America. Moving a bit farther ahead to the middle Jurassic, that's continuing, but now we're starting to see the southern Atlantic begin to sort of break its way between South America and Africa. 150 million years, the late Jurassic. Again, the Atlantic Ocean creeping up and separating South and North America. Notice too that down here there's a massive continental landmass which will eventually become Antarctica, the Indian subcontinent, and Australia. Here we are at 120 million years ago, North Atlantic getting pretty big, and we're starting to see Australia separate away from Antarctica. 105 million years ago into the Cretaceous. This is continuing on further. 90 million years ago, Australia moving farther away from Africa. India is on its way north at a rapid rate, and eventually, about 50 million years ago, will move right up to here and slam into Asia, forming the Himalayan mountains. But also, we see that the North and South Atlantic have opened up, and zingo, 65 million years ago, this is when the dinosaurs went extinct, and this is the world they lived in at that time, or didn't live in, as it were. And North America, again, has moved considerably farther north and west than it originally was. And basically, the continental arrangements were established that we still see and recognize today. Okay, so let's talk about fossils. Essentially, there's literally hundreds of dinosaur localities from the age of the dinosaurs, of course, from the Mesozoic around the world. But there's really only a handful that occur in the polar regions, in the northern and the southern polar regions, the Arctic and the Antarctic. This map sort of just summarizes those. So I put a big orange line here at 60 degrees south and 60 degrees north latitude. And I'm going to kind of call everything above that polar for the purposes of this talk. What I'd like to do is sort of show you some examples from both ends of the globe. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about one locality practically smack dab at the South Pole. It's a site for Antarctic dinosaurs, and this is a very interesting site. The example I'm going to tell you about occurs on Mount Kirkpatrick. Now, Antarctic is interesting because not only was it polar during the age of the dinosaurs, but it remains polar today, and it's a very difficult and challenging place to collect dinosaurs. But in 1991, a paleontologist at Augustana College named Bill Hammer got a bunch of money to go down to Antarctica. 13,000 feet up the side of Mount Kirkpatrick, he and his crew found remains of dinosaurs. And the dinosaur they found was new to science, and it was a dinosaur from the Jurassic period. And this dinosaur looked just like this and was given a wonderful name of Cryolophosaurus, which literally means cryo, meaning frozen, lopho, meaning crest, and saurus, meaning reptile. Cryolophosaurus. Now everybody else in the world pretty much just called it the Elvis dinosaur because of that little flaring crest on the top of its head, which made it sort of unique. Well, unfortunately, the field conditions were so difficult, he was unable to get all of the skeleton out. Got a lot of it out, but not all of it. In 1993, he was able to get some more money. It's very expensive to do field work in Antarctica and logistically challenging. He headed down with a couple of people who I know and work with, including this guy here, this guy up here, Phil Curry, and they headed back down there to dig out some more of this beast. And what they found was that, well, what they already knew, the rock up there is very, very hard. The weather up there is very, very windy, and the temperatures are very, very cold. It's very challenging work. So they enlisted the help of these, excuse me, keep pushing the wrong button. They enlisted the services of these gas-powered jackhammers, rock saws. Eventually, they had to turn to dynamite just to get the rock busted apart so they could get what they wanted out of the ground, which eventually they did, and they've brought back not only more of Cryolophosaurus, but some other dinosaur remains as well. And today, the picture that's just beginning to emerge, this is a story that certainly is not fully written, is that of an Antarctica much warmer than today, with things like Cryolophosaurus running around here in these polar forests, plant-eating dinosaurs like prosauropod dinosaurs over here on the side, and also what some people call sort of the dinosaurs of the air. These are actually not dinosaurs, but they're a separate group of reptiles called pterosaurs. This story is still being written, and they're still seeking more money to head back and get out more goodies. And hopefully we'll be able to tell you more about this in the near future. Question, yes? How do you find where the dinosaurs are? I'm going to come back to that in just a little bit. Yeah, that's a very good question. Let's take a quick look now up at the northern hemisphere, and this is where we're going to sort of spend the rest of our time. I'm going to talk a lot about dinosaurs, but I'm also going to talk about the things that I study, marine reptiles. And marine reptiles were some pretty interesting creatures living at the same time as the dinosaurs, swimming around in the oceans. And they too made it up to some pretty far northern localities. I'm going to tell you about one site where we have some remains of marine reptiles from an island archipelago called Svalbard, way up off the northeast coast of Greenland, right about there. So this is Svalbard. Now I'm actually right now involved in a research project collecting marine reptiles, Jurassic marine reptiles, from Svalbard, from the biggest island of Svalbard called Spitsbergen. Svalbard's part of, it's under Norwegian sovereignty. Okay. Now during the Jurassic, 150 million years ago, Svalbard at that time was a piece of real estate that was essentially underwater for the most part. And it was also located right up around where the Arctic Circle is. So anything we find up there for fossils were animals that lived up in the polar regions at that time as well. The bottom of that seaway, there was basically a rain of silt and mud and sediment that settled at the bottom of that seaway, becoming these very, very thick layers of rock right here. Mudstones or black shales is just what we call them. Now most of Svalbard is covered in ice, but along the western side of Spitsbergen, the largest island, we do have some beautiful outcrops of black shale. And when we start walking around out there, when we're not sort of watching over our shoulder for polar bears, we find an amazing amount of marine reptiles coming out of these rocks. As it turns out, this is some of the richest place in the world for marine reptiles, whether they're Arctic or not. And we find two major groups of marine reptiles up there. The first group are ichthyosaurs. Ichthyosaurs lived for much of the same period of time as dinosaurs did on land. Ichthyosaurs are not dinosaurs, though. They're a separate group of marine reptiles. And I think it's easy to look at that and go, hey, wait a minute, that's a dolphin you got up there. You can't fool me. Well, actually, it's not. These are not mammals. Dolphins are mammals. We are mammals. These are a very distinct group of reptiles. And one of the ways you can tell is actually kind of just looking at its tail real quick. Notice the tail is up and down, kind of more like a shark, and they're not sharks either. A dolphin's tail is held horizontally. Just sort of a quick little difference to tell them apart when you see them pictured in books. So ichthyosaurs were carnivorous. They ate meat. They ate fish and squid and probably each other. They're also very interesting because they happen to have the largest eyeballs of any animal that's ever lived on Earth. And that includes, you're thinking, I know giant squid have big eyes. No, no, these have bigger eyeballs, believe it or not, than that. And some of them have great names, such as Ophthalmosaurus, here, ophthalma meaning eye. They also got very big. And the largest ichthyosaur that we've dug up, and actually I was part of this excavation, was one collected in British Columbia. It was 75 feet long. So we're talking about some significant sized animals. Now the other group that we find up in Svalbard are plesiosaurs. These two were distributed throughout much of the Mesozoic, and they're a totally separate group of marine reptiles. These are pretty bizarre looking animals, usually compared to the Loch Ness Monster, and boy, that's a whole nother story. But essentially, if you look at the back part of the body of a plesiosaur, you can see right away it's not very much like an ichthyosaur. They don't use their tail for pushing through the water. They instead rely on this enlarged front and hind limbs that they use to essentially fly through the water. We have two major groups of plesiosaurs, those with long necks and small skulls, which we call long-necked plesiosaurs, and those with short necks and large skulls that we call short-necked plesiosaurs. And it's that original, yes. They got pretty big too. The long-necked plesiosaurs, total length, here's a diver for scale, some of these up to 35 feet in length, and I'll show you how big some of the short-necked plesiosaurs got in just a minute. So working on Svalbard is also challenging. We don't use dynamite like they did in Antarctica, but it is still a pretty challenging place to work. This photograph right here was taken last summer when we were just about the middle of August. And you can see we're pretty well bundled up in our little one-piece Helly Hansen suits trying to stay warm. Another big challenge we face up there is permafrost. You start digging a foot or two into the ground, poof, you hit frozen rock. And that's very challenging to dig out of. But in spite of this, we've found and dug some amazing things up in the last couple of years. Most of them are these long-necked plesiosaurs. We've also have this beautiful ichthyosaur skull. But our biggest find for sure was something that we just call the monster. And at the end of 2 field seasons ago, one of the people found a chunk of what we thought was rock sticking out of the ground. This is actually a small fragment from the skull of a short-necked plesiosaur. And it's hard to see really, but this is all bone. And in the middle of it is this huge tooth. It's broken. The tooth is as big as round as a large cucumber. And it's a tooth of this plesiosaur, of a short-necked plesiosaur. And in fact, there's a lot more of the skeleton coming out, which we dug up last summer. This is part of our excavation up at that site. Another nice chilly shorts and t-shirt sort of weather. But we got the thing out. We got quite a bit of it, and it's actually just now in the process of being cleaned up at the museum, at the Natural History Museum in Oslo. So if you're there anytime in the next few weeks, stop by. But what's amazing about this animal is how big it's turning out to be. Our estimates right now are that this short-necked plesiosaur is somewhere on the magnitude of about 50 feet long. And just as a little perspective on size, today, a modern-day sperm whale, an adult, a bull, a male, maximum length generally pushing about 50 feet as long as well. So this is the kind of animal swimming in the polar seas 150 million years ago. Kind of hard to imagine, but there you have it. And no, I would not want to be that diver right there. But so, a quick tour of the sea. Let's talk about what was on land, and let's talk about what was going on here in Alaska. And I think this will certainly be some familiar areas to some of you. I'll start by saying that 20 years ago, our record of dinosaurs in the state of Alaska was really practically non-existent. There were some things known, but there hadn't at that point, not much work had been done on what we did know. So there's really been a lot of exciting things that have been found, a lot of exciting work that's been done in the last 20 years. And as it turns out, it sort of helped cement Alaska's reputation as being sort of the premier place on Earth for polar dinosaurs, at least for the Arctic dinosaurs. I'm going to show you a couple of these different sites where we have collected dinosaurs from the state, and I'm going to start by talking a little bit about 2 finds down on the Alaskan Peninsula. The Alaska Peninsula, of course, right here. The first set of finds were made only a couple of years ago in Aniakchak National Monument. And you might be thinking to yourself, I don't see any bones there. Well, I didn't say we always, when we find dinosaurs, fossils, we don't always find bones. Sometimes we find tracks. Both of the sites in the Alaska Peninsula are clearly evidence and fossils of dinosaurs, but they happen to be dinosaur tracks. The first that I'm going to show you here are of some sort of a plant-eating dinosaur, probably from this sort of an animal called a hadrosaur, a duck-billed dinosaur. Now the kind of track that you're looking at here is probably, it may not be recognizable, but essentially this is the kind of track we call a natural cast. When a dinosaur walks across the ground, pushes its foot into, say, soft mud and pulls out, it leaves this depression. If that depression fills with sand, that sand becomes sandstone, and if then the underlying softer mud weathers away, what you're left with is this natural cast. And that's exactly what this is right here, looking from above and from the side. And it's essentially, you can see exactly where this animal pushed its foot in. Sometimes these are so well preserved, we get skin impressions on the bottom, from the bottom of the foot pad. We also have dinosaur tracks, this time from meat-eating dinosaurs from near Black Lake on the Alaska Peninsula as well. Now, this site has not been fully documented at all, and I don't even have pictures of what those tracks look like. This is, this is sort of a representative meat-eating or theropod dinosaur track from Utah, but you get the general gist. Again, they are natural casts. This is a site we got to get back to and find out some more about. Probably a lot of you here have heard about this site. This was one of the most recent new localities for dinosaur fossils in the state, and it was basically in our backyard at Denali National Park. And as the story goes with this one, it's pretty interesting. It's a bunch of geologists, professor and geologist students were on a field trip out in Denali, and the professor, Paul McCarthy, says, hey, you know, I think there might be some dinosaur tracks. This would be the right types of rock. And one of the students, Susie Tomish, says, oh, you mean like this? And she points to a track just like that. And sure enough, This is the dinosaur track. This is one of the dinosaur tracks that have been found. There's actually, now that we've seen them and recognized them there's many more sites have been found in the park, as well as tracks of wading birds that lived at the same time. So these are tracks from the late Cretaceous, Upper Cretaceous Cantwell Formation, about 70 million years old. And by the way, the student who found those is now working on these tracks as part of her master's project. So happy ending there. So let's talk about a few bones from the state. Well, we've got dinosaur tracks from a variety of places. We have dinosaur bones from 2 sites in the Talkeetna Mountains, kind of to the, in the south central part of the state, right up in here. The first find was made several years ago, and there's some bones, a partial skeleton of a duck-billed dinosaur from rocks of the Matanuska Formation. These rocks are a bit older, and in fact, the fossils that we have are of a duck-billed dinosaur. But this particular duck-billed dinosaur, these bones are from rocks of an age that's very early in the evolutionary history of duck-billed dinosaurs. And this specimen, which has not been described yet, is actually, it could be very informative and very interesting. And hopefully I'll have more to tell you about that in the near future as well. And we also have remains from the Talkeetnas of a very odd dinosaur, one of the stranger groups of dinosaurs called ankylosaurs. Basically, they are tanks, the tanks of the Cretaceous. And these are dinosaurs that are heavily armored. They have bone just about everywhere you can put them on your body. And you'd be hard pressed to believe it, but this thing that looks like a chunk of rock is actually the skull of an ankylosaur, and of one particular kind called Edmontonia. It could be easily overlooked, and I bet you there's probably many that have been. This is an illustration of a more complete skull not from Alaska, to give you sort of an idea that they had this very heavy, thick bony skull. And when you look on the bottom side, you can see the tooth row right there. So what's interesting about both of these finds from the Talkeetna Mountains is that both of them are found in rocks that were laid down at the bottom of a sea. Now, we don't think the dinosaurs lived in these seas. We know they didn't. These are animals that did what we call the bloat and float. So they died, washed out to sea. They kind of puffed up with decay gases and floated around and finally went pop and sank to the ocean floor. So that's sometimes the way we find them. It's pretty interesting. But far and away, the best record for dinosaurs in Alaska comes from the North Slope. And it's not a single locality, but several sites scattered across the North Slope. So far, we have the record for of at least 8 to 10 different kinds of dinosaurs from the North Slope. And we also have a lot of other interesting things like Cretaceous mammals, which are little kind of rodent-y looking things, but very rare and interesting. And other types of fish and turtles as well. Now, if you look at a map of the geology of the North Slope, essentially what you see is a map that's colored with lots of green, and that's great if you're a paleontologist. Green means Cretaceous. That means the rocks of the right age. We get excited. Now, if you want to find fossils on the North Slope, what you need to do, the real key though to the puzzle, is rivers. That whole area, of course, for the most part, is covered in tundra, and you can't really see the rocks. But where the rivers cut through the tundra down into the bedrock, to the Cretaceous age bedrock where the dinosaurs are, bingo, you're in business. And essentially what you do is you float down these rivers in a boat, and you look at outcrops like this. This is along the Colville River. Most of the finds on the North Slope have come from the Colville River, but finds have been made from other rivers up there as well. And going back to the question we had earlier, how do you know to find these? Well, first, you saw the first clue was we looked at a geologic map that shows us that the rocks were there of the right age. So we said, okay, they're Cretaceous rocks. Dinosaurs lived in the Cretaceous. Let's go have a look there. The other thing we do is when we actually get out and we walk, when we get to the outcrop, sometimes people think, well, what do? Just walk up to the hill and start digging a hole? Well, if you want to get a good workout, yes. If you want to find fossils, no. What we mostly do is we get out and we walk the outcrops, and we just back and forth, days and days, sometimes way too many hours of looking and not much finding. But when we find a bone sticking out of the hill, then and only then do we actually start digging those fossils out of the ground. Such is the case here with Kelly May, son of one of the people who works at the museum, who's spent a lot of time up on the North Slope. And what he's got right here is part of a dinosaur bone that was sticking out of the side of this hill. And when he saw that sticking out, that's when you start to dig. So what have we got for a record up there? Well, let me just point out a couple of the meat-eating dinosaurs first. We have at least 4 different kinds of meat-eating dinosaurs, mostly known from their teeth. Far and away the most common of those is Troodon. This is Troodon right here. This is a human-sized dinosaur, so if it was standing here next to me, its head would have come about even with my head. And it's got a very distinctive tooth right here that are only about a centimeter or so long. We also find the teeth, though, of a relative of Tyrannosaurus rex. The rocks up there are not young enough to be Tyrannosaurus rex, to have Tyrannosaurus rex, but some close cousins, perhaps something called Albertosaurus. We also have teeth and other remains from smaller dinosaurs, sort of medium-sized meat-eating dinosaurs that we call Dromaeosaurs. This is pretty typical of a tooth that you might find weathering out of an outcrop. Plant eaters. Of course, the most abundant fossils are plant eaters. Today, when you walk out on the North Slope, you're not going to see that many wolves and polar bears or brown bears. You're going to see a lot more of the plant eaters. You're going to see a lot more caribou. Same thing with the North Slope during the Cretaceous. One of the kinds of animals we have there is a pachycephalosaur. Wonderful name, pachycephalosaur. Thick-headed or dome-headed dinosaurs. Plant eaters that are also human-sized. We have a few bits of this smaller plant eater called Thescelosaurus. And probably the neatest remains we've found more recently are those of a horned dinosaur, kind of a relative of Triceratops, called Pachyrhinosaurus. Now, Pachyrhinosaurus, it doesn't look like Triceratops because Triceratops has got these 3 big horns. It's got 1 off of its nose and 2 off the back of its head. And Pachyrhinosaurus actually doesn't have that big horn coming off the top of its nose, if you will. Instead, it has a big mass of bone called a boss. And that's what gives it its name, Pachyrhinosaurus. Means sort of heavy-nosed lizard. It's a great name. Our most common dinosaur remains from the North Slope is the plant eaters, and these are duck-billed dinosaurs. Far and away, the most abundant remains are duck-billed dinosaurs, bones and tracks. And duck-billed dinosaurs, you can sort of see here the human for scale, we would have come up to about their hip on an adult duck-billed dinosaur, maybe 30 feet long as adults. And one of them that we find up there in the greatest numbers is called Edmontosaurus. Very much you can see why they get the name duck-billed dinosaur. We have one particularly productive locality for duck-billed dinosaurs, and it's a site called the Liscombe Bonebed. So bone beds may be a little sort of surprising way of finding dinosaur bones. A bone bed is essentially, it's a layer of rock, and in this case it's a layer of rock about 2 to 3 feet thick, and in it are the remains, the thousands and thousands of bones of duck-billed dinosaurs, but they're not all put together nicely in a complete skeleton like an animal would have looked like in life. Instead, it's like taking a herd of duck-billed dinosaurs, throwing into a blender, hitting puree, and then sort of dashing that out, mixing it with some mud, and then dashing it out onto the ground. That's what this bone bed is like. Every time you dig out a bone, the one next to it that you dig out is almost certainly not from the same individual dinosaur. The other really interesting thing about this bone bed layer, which is pretty extensive and runs way across this outcrop here, is that the dinosaurs in it are not adults, or very rarely do we find adult bones. Most of them are from young animals, very young animals in some cases, animals that may only be 10 or 20% adult size. I'm just going to quickly also mention one little thing right here. There's a little hole, a little door in the side of the hill. You may have heard about this. I won't get into a lot of details here, but last year, with some support from ConocoPhillips, there was a hole, a tunnel, about 30 feet deep into the hill that was dug to access the bones still frozen in permafrost of the bone bed. This is work that we just initiated last year and we'll hopefully be doing more of in upcoming summers. So I'll just say that there'll be more to say about this in the near future. But what I'd like to do now is sort of turn to some of the interesting questions. We know that we have a huge and diverse array of dinosaurs from the North Slope. And as a paleontologist, what we do now is we're not just content to say, okay, I've got Troodon and I've got duck-billed dinosaurs. We want to say something interesting about them. We want to know what their life was like. So we start to ask questions. So some of the questions we're asking are a little bit to do with, like, what kind of environment did they live in? What was their world like? You know, what kind of things were they eating? And where were they on the globe at the time that this was happening? And as it turns out, we'll also see, we'll want to find out how the heck they managed to live up there in the winter. I'll come back to that in a minute. So the first question I'd like to just sort of briefly answer, we don't have answers for all these, but I can give you some background. One of the first questions has to do with their environment. What kind of world did they live in? During the Mesozoic, at the start of the Mesozoic, Alaska basically, as we know it, did not exist. It was simply kind of an open area of ocean off the northwest coast of the North American continent. But during the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, basically small pieces of land, relatively small pieces of land, sort of came together and got grouped together and congealed into what we now call Alaska. And one of those collisions between land masses on the north part of Alaska produced the beginnings of what we now call the Brooks Range. So way up here at the North Slope, the Brooks Range started to take rise, especially during the Cretaceous. And rivers, much like today, flowed off that Brooks Range to the ocean, to the Arctic Ocean basin up here to the north. And it was across this coastal plain, this broad plain, that these dinosaurs, these 8 or 10 different types of dinosaurs I've described, once roamed. So it's kind of interesting to imagine sort of these broad rivers with herds of dinosaurs tramping across them. But there's a little bit more to this story about where they lived, and that has to do with how far north they were. Today, the current latitude of Barrow, Alaska, right up there at the northernmost tip of Alaska, is about 71 degrees north latitude. So it's pretty far up there, pretty well up there. Where do you think Barrow was situated during the Mesozoic, during, we'll say the Cretaceous? Any guesses? Was it north, south, east, west? South? Actually, interestingly enough, it was north. It was a lot farther north, potentially. Some of the estimates placed the North Slope, where these dinosaurs were living, farther north by as much as 10 degrees or so north of where they are today. Wow. That's pretty interesting. So in other words, the North Pole was just a hop, skip, and a jump away by comparison to today. So that raises a quick question. All right, what the heck was, what was the climate like at that time? Well, some of the best evidence for the climate at that time comes from plant fossils. You hear a lot about the dinosaurs from the North Slope. You probably don't hear that much about the plant fossils, but there are some wonderful plant localities on the North Slope, especially from rocks around 90 to 100 million years old. And paleobotanists have examined these and looked at them and have come up with a pretty startling conclusion, is that there's really good evidence for polar forests at the time that these dinosaurs were running around. Forest up at 75, 80 degrees north latitude. Quite remarkable. And you may scoff at that and say, oh, I can't believe it. But have a look, have a look right here. Here is an outcrop along one of the rivers on the North Slope. This is an upright tree stump from a tree that was this big around. Now these trees, as it turns out, were mostly conifers, and they were deciduous conifers. So they're conifers that lost their needles every year. So it seems as though the majority of the trees in the forest were made of these deciduous coniferous trees. We also, though, have evidence for a lot of other types of flowering plants, and in fact, life seemed to be quite diverse with an understory of ferns and horsetails and other things like cycads. The other nice thing about plant fossils was we can actually use them to put some numbers on how warm it was. And we do this by using a term called mean annual temperature, or another way of putting it is average yearly temperature. And before I throw you some numbers out at you, I'd like to ask you, do you know what the average yearly temperature for Fairbanks, Alaska is? Where you live? -1 Celsius, yeah, basically. Put that in more user-friendly terms. Yeah, 27 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's basically calculated by taking the high and low temperature of every day and averaging it, and doing that for every day across the year and averaging those numbers. So our average annual temperature here is a little bit below freezing. How about Barrow, Alaska? Anyone know that number off the top of your head? 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Juneau? Do you know Juneau? Ooh, 41 degrees. What do you think it was 100 million years ago, 90 million years ago on the North Slope of Alaska? 34, okay. 50 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit. That's downright balmy. It's hard to believe we had temperatures like that in the North Slope of Alaska. As it turned out, this trend cooled during the latter part of the Cretaceous, 75 million years ago, when the Liscombe bone bed was laid down, probably temperatures more in a 37 to 45 degree range. So what that means is temperatures were, on average, above freezing, but certainly it implies that there were some cooler temperatures during the winter, possibly some freezing temperatures with some seasonal snow, but nothing like today. Well, there's one other major factor that you have to contend with when you talk about living at high latitudes, and that's one that we all know, of course. It's dark. And when you're up, basically these figures are just up there to sort of remind you what you already know, is the farther north you go in the northern latitudes, the farther north you go in the winter, the longer and the darker the winter is. And in fact, when you think about these dinosaurs living up at 75, 80 degrees north latitude, even if it was warmer than today, they still had to cope with extended periods of darkness. So where are we at? So basically we've got a whole bunch of really cool dinosaurs on the North Slope. They live farther north than they are today. They lived in a warmer climate, but still coolish in the winter. They had lots of deciduous plants to eat during the summer. We'll talk about the winter in a second. And they had to contend with some long periods of darkness. So this raises some pretty interesting questions. The biggest one is, well, let me put it this way. It's a no-brainer. It would have been a great place to live in the summer. What did they do in the wintertime? Well, as it turns out, coping with the polar winter during the age of dinosaurs is a question that is very much unanswered. But I'm going to give you a couple of three options that you can think about. And the first these are three options, by the way, that modern animals use as well. And the first option is hibernate. You dig a hole in the ground and you hole up for the winter. Well, maybe some of the smaller dinosaurs did this, but I have a hard time envisioning a herd of 30-foot-long duck-billed dinosaurs taking the same tact. So we're just going to rule that one out for right now. I'm going to talk about a second possible option, which is to migrate. Just get the heck out of there during the winter. This is a pretty tantalizing idea. And as the story goes, dinosaurs would hang out here on the North Slope, and they would migrate along the edge of what's called the Western Interior Seaway, southward along coastal plain environments, moving into more favorable climates, into more food. One of the issues that people have raised about this idea, though, is that because Alaska was so far north, to get from here just even down to the Arctic Circle might have been a hike of over 1,000 miles, possibly more. Then you start to think about these very young, not babies, but young dinosaurs at the Liscombe bone bed that we have evidence for. Could they have made a migration of that length at maybe 1 or 2 years of age? Don't know. Something to think about. Don't have any answers here. Sorry, if you're looking for a punchline, by the way. But I'll give you another option. And option number 3, tough it out. And this is actually sort of the idea that most people seem to favor at the moment, although I think it's hard to generalize all dinosaurs as doing one or the other. Certainly some of these things might have some species might have been using one approach and some species another. But if you were going to cope with the polar winter and tough it out, it would have meant kind of different things to different dinosaurs. If you were a plant eater, you would have perhaps taken the approach of having spent the summer months sort of gorging yourself, getting fat like some animals do today, trying to put on as much food and fat as you could during the summer so that you could make it through the lean times. And the other thing we don't really know, we know that the vegetation was largely deciduous, but perhaps not all of it was deciduous, and certainly there probably were a few evergreen plants, but could they have sustained large populations of duck-billed dinosaurs? We don't know. That's a tough one to answer. Now, if you were a meat-eating dinosaur like Troodon, it would have also been sort of a different story. You would have, of course, needed something to stick around so you could have eaten it. And some of the smaller dinosaurs that we find up there may very well have served the purpose. But there's also another interesting suggestion that comes with this animal here, Troodon. You might recall I mentioned it's the most common meat-eating dinosaur that we find on the North Slope. Troodon is also kind of interesting because it has the largest eye of any dinosaur, basically for its size, that we know of as well. And the suggestion has been made that maybe the reason we find more teeth of Troodon up on the North Slope is because there were just simply more of those animals living at the time. And they might have been in greater numbers there because they had larger eyes. Larger eyes may have allowed greater ability to see and given them an advantage in dark winters and even in the summer in a polar forest environment. So these are sorts of things that, these are some of the ideas we're tossing around, thinking about. We're not really sure. We don't have answers. But I'll just sort of finish up by saying that it's questions like this that sort of spur us to go back every year, to go out and spend time, battling with mosquitoes and polar bears or whatever else might be the case in order to dig up more material, to sort of fill out the picture. And of course, once we find more information, we have more questions to ask and we have to go back again. But this is kind of what we do as paleontologists. And Alaska has really, as I said, taken the lead role as being the place to study the polar dinosaurs, the Arctic dinosaurs in the world. And I hope to be able to help continue fleshing out that story in future years. So thank you very much. Good question. So the question is, are there really any whole dinosaurs? We have found partial skeletons, especially of things like Pachyrhinosaurus, and we've certainly found lots of bones of duck-billed dinosaurs, some kind of parts, but no, we don't actually have a single complete dinosaur that's been found in the state of Alaska yet. So hopefully we'll be able to do that, but it often takes a lot of time before we find those. The impression is often that when we do find dinosaurs that they they tend to be whole, complete skeletons. That's actually not the case. It's more common that we find parts of their skeletons. And it may seem like, boy, you can say a lot based on a tooth or a this or a that, but you can actually make a lot of important, make a lot of interesting observations about partial skeletons. Yes? Okay. Oh, we got one over here.
Where are the other places that there are major collections that you can research that would replicate the polar development here?
Oh, other places to find the polar dinosaurs? Yeah. There have been some interesting finds made in Canada, and some of those collections are held partly at the Tyrrell Museum and partly at the National Museum, I believe, in Ottawa. I believe in Ottawa. Let's see. There are finds that have been made in Siberia as well. And I believe most of those remains are housed in, I'm not sure, but I want to say in Moscow, but I'm not 100% certain about that. Most of those collections, though, I know my predecessor had spent some time trying to make connections with some of the people in Russia, but unfortunately wasn't able to do that. It's a pretty difficult place to do field work sometimes. So for the Northern Hemisphere, those are probably collections in Canada and in Alaska are probably some of the biggest ones that I could list off the top of my head.
What about Scandinavia?
Scandinavia, unfortunately, now that I've been working there a bit, Scandinavia has, they do have some nice collections at the museums in Stockholm and in Oslo, but there's not much dinosaur material. In fact, Norway doesn't have a single scrap of dinosaur bone, and the only bone that they have now comes from Svalbard, which isn't really on Norwegian, part of the Norwegian mainland. So the record in Scandinavia is dictated by the geology. There's just not a lot of rocks of the right age there, dinosaur age at least. Yeah?
I was wondering, how do you tell the difference between a a reptile and a mammal bone? You said you were finding reptiles and mammals. Like, how do you know that, well, this one's definitely a mammal bone, this one's a reptile bone? So I was just kind of curious.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. Basically, if you're talking about mammals from the age of dinosaurs, you're talking about something in this size range right here. Some little kind of squirrel, mouse-sized animal. And most of what we find are teeth. And those teeth are very, very informative. I always joke that some of the people who study mammal fossils often just kind of, if they had a whole skeleton, it wouldn't matter. They just bash the teeth out and throw the rest away anyway, because a lot of what they study just is dealing with the teeth. It's an exaggeration, though, but in case there's any mammalian people out there.
We have a question back here.
Oh, okay.
What made them die?
What made the dinosaurs die? Oh, boy. Well, next question. Oh, no, I'll try to. Okay. We really don't know. That's a very good question. It's a question far from being answered. A couple of things. We do have a fairly decent record, rock record, indicating that it seems like something pretty darn big from outer space slammed into Earth about the same time dinosaurs died. People have been squabbling. Did this asteroid hit at the same, basically, was it the smoking gun? Did it hit at the same time dinosaurs went extinct? And our ability to tell, we can't tell a week apart in the rock record. We can't tell a few days or a few months or years. We're talking about our margin of error being in the thousands, if not tens and hundreds of thousands of years. So that's a pretty big margin of error. So we're not sure. There have been some other ideas that, well, look, basically everything you can think of, from very, very rapidly changing climates, potentially a lot of volcanism in places like India that might have poisoned the atmosphere with gas. Even disease has been suggested, although I find that one kind of difficult to swallow. So maybe someday you'll grow up and figure that one out for us. It's right here.
You said that most of the fossils were young dinosaurs on the North Slope. Why?
Why are most of the fossils young animals? We have pretty good reason to believe that most duck-billed dinosaurs, as well as most horned dinosaurs like that Pachyrhinosaurus, were herding animals. So they seem to travel in big groups, but why at a particular instant in time a herd of dinosaurs may have been wiped out that were just younger, juvenile-sized animals, it's hard to say. We basically, that bone bed probably captures a window in time of a dead herd of dinosaurs, and the herd may have been comprised primarily of younger animals that were staying together. We see that in modern environments as well, with modern organisms as well, where sometimes younger animals will stay together in herds, if you will, or in groups. But again, it's a tough one to really be sure about. Yeah.
How do you establish ownership of a fossil find? We know that there's quite a bit of thievery going on in the western states when people find something, whether it be on private land or public land. And I was just kind of curious how you, other than sort of staking a claim and saying, this is ours, how do you protect it from the unsavory ones?
Oh, okay. Yeah, when we find fossils, when we go out looking, we always, as a museum, we go out and we make sure we know exactly whose land it is that we're walking around on and who has ownership. We won't even begin to dig unless we know that this is a specimen that we can, we'll be able to take back to the museum to study. If a fossil is found in a very remote place, like on federal land, which is most of the state, of course, then there isn't necessarily a way that, we can sort of, if we knew it was there, we could say, yes, we're going to come back, we're going to dig this up. But that wouldn't stop anyone from necessarily sneaking out and taking fossils out of the ground. There are certainly examples of that having happened in the lower 48 that I can think of, and created a lot of bad blood. And some people have been arrested over it, and it's a very tricky situation. If it's land, if it's private land, it's up to the landowner to decide what to do with it. They can say, I don't want you to touch it. They can say, okay, you found it, but I'm going to sell it to this guy. It's really up to the landowner. But for federal fossils on federal land and state land, our museum is the federal repository for the state of Alaska. If you find dinosaurs on NPR land or BLM land, our museum is where they at least have to be cataloged through before someone else can work on them or study them.
We have a question up here.
Yeah. Yes.
With these great big animals, I assume they're warm-blooded. Were any of the dinosaurs cold-blooded?
Ah, the warm-blooded, cold-blooded. Yes, that's a tricky thing. Certainly what we think of dinosaurs were probably not certainly behaving and acting, and they didn't have a physiology like some slow-moving lizard did today. But based on taking bones, for example, slicing them up, looking at the details, the cellular structure of the bones, they certainly seem to have some, they seem to be doing something closer to what we would call warm-bloodedness. And in fact, we often study modern birds because we now understand birds are descendant of a group of meat-eating dinosaurs, and we can look at sort of the way they live. We would call birds warm-blooded. Well, their ancestors had something that was like warm-blooded as well, and presumably that was fairly widespread across the dinosaur world, but it probably varied quite a bit too. I mean, when you've got dinosaurs, some of them are this big, and you've got dinosaurs that are 120 feet long, there's probably going to be some variation in there as well. Yeah. Question way back there.
The assemblage of the landmass of Alaska over that period from 250 to 65 million years was pretty interesting, and obviously that Svalbard area is kind of stuck out by itself, and if Norway had no dinosaur fossils found yet, was Svalbard from somewhere else over that period?
Svalbard, by comparison to Alaska especially, is pretty much has been pretty much where it is. I mean, it was not sort of the same scenario as Alaska, where pieces were accreted together, were sort of grouped together. It was pretty much seafloor, and it was just on the edge of what is now kind of the Eurasian plate. So it's been pretty quiet in comparison to Alaska, in terms of mountain building events and things of that sort. Oh, right over here. Yep.
How do we know that the amount of daylight we have now is the same as it was in the past, so that you know that the winters may not have been so severe? And then, have there been any studies, since the continents have all changed configuration, oceans have two possible currents, maybe keeping a little more balmy in the winter than it is now? Any studies on those things?
Oh, yeah. Two good questions. So to determine, to the first part of the question, was it as dark as it today, is the questions people have asked. Because really what determines how dark it is sort of our, what's called that angle of obliquity. It's how much our Earth relative to the sun doesn't spin sort of, if this is the sun, it doesn't spin perfectly vertical on its axis. It's sort of tilted, and it's that tilt that provides us with our seasons. We assume, and there are various lines of evidence supporting this, and I couldn't tell you what they are, but I'm told at least that the amount of kind of wobble in that angle has varied over time, and it does vary over time, but hasn't varied significantly since the Mesozoic, since the age of dinosaurs. We're pretty much assuming that the angle that our long axis of our Earth is spinning on is tipping close to the 23 degrees it is today. It may have varied a couple of degrees on either side. Second question has to do with ocean currents. And yes, people have looked at this in a lot of detail, dealing with ocean circulation. So when you start moving continents, you definitely change ocean circulation patterns. And a great example there is when some of the ocean currents that once were circling the southern part of the world around Antarctica, when South America is fully split away from Antarctica and moved north, basically a series of currents were set up around the southern globe that put Antarctica into a deep freeze, into chill, that created these ice caps. And so exactly what was happening in the northern hemisphere certainly could have been different. It could have helped, indeed, it could have very much helped keep those temperatures warmer on the North Slope. I can't give you a whole lot of more detail than that, unfortunately, but it's a good question, and it's the sort of thing that people have looked into. Yes. Yes, way back there.
Where do you think that, where do you think you might find the most bones in the world?
Where could you find the most bones in the world? Boy, like dinosaur bones? Well, you know, if I were to go to one place where I wanted to be sure I could find lots of dinosaur bones, I'd go to Dinosaur Provincial Park in Alberta, Canada. And I spent a lot of time there, and it's amazing. It's just crazy, the kind of stuff you find there. It's literally, you take a few steps, and there's another bone, and there's another bone, and they have bone beds, and they've got these beautiful complete skeletons of meat-eating dinosaurs and plant-eating dinosaurs, and it's about as good as it gets. So that's where I would go. I always love to go back to Alberta. So that's
why is it that way?
Why is it that way? Well, essentially two big reasons. One, it was in the right place at the time the dinosaurs were living there. There was a good place to die and get buried in the right types of sediment. And these were floodplains of rivers. And so these dinosaurs would die. They'd get buried by streams and other sorts of river sorts of processes. They get buried. And those rocks piled up, piled up, piled up. And today, this is the second reason, today those rocks are exposed at the surface, and there's river drainages that have cut down to just the right level. These are drainages along the Red Deer River that have exposed these beautiful, beautiful outcrops of rock. And that's where the bones are sticking out. Yeah.
We have a question back here.
Right there, yeah.
What information compels you to discard the theory that disease could have wiped out the dinosaurs?
Oh, why could okay, so why did disease probably not, that's a very good question. You know, disease is caused by life as well, by organisms that were living in the animals that were around at the time. And those diseases sort of live and behave a little bit like the land animals. And one of the worst things you can do if you're a bug that causes animals to get sick is to kill your host. If you do such a good job of it that you wipe out not only the species you live in, but all sorts of species, that's kind of not really a great thing for you to do, as it were, for an organism to do, whether it's a bacterium or a meat-eating dinosaur. The other thing about that is the kinds of animals, like today, a lot of diseases are pretty specific to certain types of animals. We might get some diseases that other mammals get, maybe something like even a dog could get, but I don't think we get too many of the same diseases that lizards get, or that things that are living in the ocean got. And remember, the extinction occurred not just on land, but at sea. In fact, it was even more pronounced at sea, where animals like these giant coiled things called ammonites all died out as well. So that's part of the reasoning, but you know what? Maybe it was part of the story. You know, I think what happened probably with the extinction event is a lot of bad things came together at the wrong time. And it probably is more productive to think about a whole bunch of causes of extinction rather than just looking for that one single thing.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for coming.